Greetings and welcome to another impressions video here at Words About Games, and today we're going to be looking at Bookbound Brigade. Bookbound Brigade is a 2D platforming Metroidvania game set in a fantasy universe where classic literature and historical figures lived in a shared world. Called the Literary World, it's powered by the Book of Books, which creates the literary world from other stories, mashing everything together into one gigantic fantasy world. When someone steals the Book of Books, aka Bob, and throws the literary world into chaos, a group of classic literary characters and historical figures team up to find Bob and save the world. Bookbound Brigade is a wonderful idea. It's one of those types of games I can't quite believe no one has thought of before, essentially creating a shared universe for all of the greatest characters in classical literature, with a few iconic historical figures thrown in for good measure. Your adventuring party is made up of characters such as Queen Victoria, Nikola Tesla, Dracula, Sun Wukong, and more, and you'll run across other characters such as Joan of Arc and Julius Caesar, all while travelling across worlds inspired by classical Greek literature, pirate adventures, and more. Basically, it's an incredibly inventive setting for an adventure game. It's also very self-aware, and pokes fun at itself and its characters as often as possible. Bookbound Brigade's version of Queen Victoria is an angry woman constantly looking for a fight, even going so far as to instigate a boss fight against an enemy who was otherwise more than happy to let the brigade pass in peace. The tone and humour in this game, they're incredibly hit and miss. There's some stuff that works really well, the world itself is smartly put together, and the cast of classic characters is well thought out. And when the humour leans on the more subtle side, it can be really amusing. Joan of Arc giving you a side quest to retrieve her new fireproof suit of armour is delightfully amusing. But all too often I found Bookbound Brigade to be trying too hard to get a laugh. The first joke about Joan of Arc being afraid of fire was kind of funny. The 10th? Not so funny. The decision to have characters talk to each other as if they're all big-time social media influencers was a bit baffling as well. Again, this is an on and off problem. Sometimes the characters will talk to each other normally, and when they do it can be amusing. Sun Wukong suddenly terrified that the sky has turned to stone, only to be reminded by King Arthur that no, they're just underground and they've talked about this before. And then a character will start saying lol or talking about Facebook, and it just felt cringy and out of place. Hit and miss is a really good way to describe how I felt while I was playing the game. One of the more unique features of Bookbound Brigade is the brigade itself. Rather than controlling one character, you control an entire group, starting with 6 and growing to 8. They move and fight as one unit. As you progress, you unlock different formations for the brigade that have different advantages. The column formation sees everyone standing on each other's heads, for example, where the rolling wheel formation sees them form the, well, rolling wheel. This works really well for puzzle solving and exploration. Dodging traps and hazards and finding new paths is given an extra layer of complexity when you've also got to think about the configuration of your party. While it doesn't really lend any extra challenge to the game, it's fairly obvious what formation you need the brigade to be in. It makes puzzle solving a little more involved. But while the game is enjoyable during exploration, it's incredibly frustrating during combat. As I mentioned before, the brigade move and fight as one cohesive unit. You'll do varying amounts of damage and have access to different moves depending on your formation. Most of Bookbound Brigade's fights revolve around juggling and launching smaller enemies at larger ones to stun them and open them up to an attack, because fighting them head on is a very bad idea. But a litany of problems plague the game's combat mechanics. The controls are too imprecise for what it's trying to achieve. It's difficult to keep the brigade facing the correct direction while juggling enemies, so you'll constantly fire them in the wrong direction. Quickly switching between formations is impossible. Every time I tried, it simply didn't work, instead taking multiple button pushes to work, which leads into the bigger issue of trying to dodge enemy attacks while landing blows of your own. Most attacks from larger enemies require one formation, while stunning them with smaller enemies requires a different one. Because of the limited range you can launch smaller enemies and the fact that you have to be facing the right way, it takes time to set yourself up to even attempt to land a stun. By which point, you're probably taking a ton of damage from the attacks you can't dodge while you're attempting to go on the offensive. It all makes combat feel incredibly messy, relying more on blind luck than any kind of player input. There are some interesting ideas on paper, but in practice, it's just maddeningly inconsistent and constantly frustrating. I really try to love Bookbound Brigade. There's just enough charm and inventiveness here that this could have been a really enjoyable game. Exploration and puzzle solving is fun thanks to the inventiveness of the formations you can employ, thanks to the way the brigade works. And when it's not trying too hard to be over the top laugh out loud funny, this is actually quite a witty game. But the way the combat is set up has really turned me off. any major engagements involving larger enemies, and especially boss fights, eventually letting me putting the game down and not really wanting to play anymore. Thanks very much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it or found it useful, consider sticking around here at Words About Games. Our content includes review impressions of games big and small, a weekly podcast dedicated to discussing the happenings in and around the games industry, weekly opinion videos, reactions, debate-driven top 5 and top 10 lists, a regular Hall of Fame series where we discuss our favourite games, and indie game spotlights. We also stream every Friday and Saturday at twitch.tv/wordsaboutgames. Most importantly, have a brilliant day.